Hey, welcome back to Cinemania Recapped. In the beginning of the movie, we see a stately mansion nearby a pond. Here, a woman named Grace wakes up from her nightmare screaming. We then see a scene outside the mansion where three people are walking towards it. Grace opens the door and invites the three people inside since she had advertised in the newspaper for servants to work in the house. So these three have come to work for Grace. The old lady's name is Bartha Mills, the elderly man's name is Mr. Tuttle, and the girl's name is Lydia. Grace asks Lydia what she can do, but Lydia does not respond, prompting Mrs. Mills to inform Grace that Lydia is mute but works exceptionally well. It should be noted that Grace and these three people are dead. They do not exist in this world anymore. We will find out why these three unfamiliar people are here by the end of the movie. Now Grace begins explaining the work to the servants, and Mr. Mills and Mr. Tuttle assure Grace that they are very sincere and hardworking people, so she will not receive any complaints about their work. Mrs. Mills asks Grace about her husband, to which Grace tells them that her husband went to war about a year and a half ago and has not been heard from since the war ended. Grace is very strict by nature and loves her children dearly. She tells everyone that silence is highly valued in her house, so there will be no signs of any noise-making things like telephones, radios, or TVs. There is also no electricity in the house because the Germans used to cut off the power time and time again during the war, which is why she has gotten used to living without electricity. Grace assigns Mr. Tuttle the job of gardener, kitchen work to Mrs. Mills, and the cleaning duties to Lydia. Grace instructs everyone to keep the curtains closed because her children are photosensitive, meaning they cannot be exposed to sunlight. Now Grace introduces her children to Mrs. Mills and Lydia. We see that Grace has two small but very adorable children, the son named Nicholas and the daughter named Anne, and they greet Mrs. Mills and Lydia. It is important to mention that these children are also not alive. Now the children ask Mrs. Mills if she is their new nanny, to which she responds, yes. Grace then tells Mrs. Mills that no doctor has been able to treat her children because they are severely allergic to light and sunlight. They are photosensitive, and bringing them into the sunlight could endanger their lives. Now the scene shifts, and we see Anne asking Mrs. Mills when the former servants will return, to which she replies that they will never come back again. Anne then asks if Mrs. Mills will leave them too, to which she responds, never. The scene shifts again, and we see Grace and Mrs. Mills, where Grace tells her that the letter she sent for the advertisement was supposed to reach the press within 5 days, but it has still not reached, as it remained in the mailbox. Hence, how did all of you arrive at my house? Mrs. Mills informs her that they arrived there at the right time. She tells Grace that she, Lydia, and Mr. Tuttle have worked in this house before, and that it holds indelible place in their hearts. She further says that she is acquainted with every corner of this house. After this, Grace begins to close all the curtains because her daughter is about to pass by. Now Grace asks Mrs. Mills if she has children, then she responds that Lydia and Mr. Tuttle are her family. Hereafter, Grace hears a child's crying and believes either Nicholas or Anne is crying, so she rushes to check on her children. She sees that Nicholas is quietly studying in his room, after which she goes to check on Anne and finds that Anne is also memorizing her lesson with full concentration. Grace asks Anne if she was crying, to which she denies. Anne explains to her mother that the voice was from Victor. Grace asks who Victor is, then Anne tells her that Victor is telling her to vacate the house. He says that this house belongs to him. Grace dismisses Anne's claims as nonsense and begins to yell at her. At that moment, she notices the door is ajar. Following this, Grace scolds Mrs. Mills and Lydia, asking how the doors can be left open while they are present. Mrs. Mills states that she was outside in the garden with Mr. Tuttle. Now we see Nicholas and Anne at the dining table where Nicholas asks Anne if she really saw Victor and whether he is a ghost. The scene cuts here. Now we see Anne waking Nicholas, telling him that Victor has drawn back the curtains and does this all night long. Then Anne tells Victor to come out from behind the curtains so Nicholas can see him. Nicholas gets scared and lies down and asks Anne not to scare him anymore. Anne gets up to draw the curtains again, but shortly after, Victor draws them back again and asks Anne to leave his bed. Following this, Victor touches Nicholas, making him scream for his mother. Grace immediately rushes into the children's room, where Nicholas tells Grace that Anne is scaring him. So Grace looks angrily at Anne and orders her to read 10 pages of the Bible as punishment. The scene cuts and we see Grace working on embroidery when she hears a noise coming from the room above, causing the chandelier to sway violently. Grace thinks Lydia is knocking things around, so she calls out to her, but Grace sees that Lydia is outside talking with Mrs. Mills. She now heads upstairs and asks Anne who is making the noise, to which Anne replies she cannot tell. She says whoever it is in the junk room. So Grace heads towards the junk room. She looks around and finds everything in order, but then she hears someone talking in the room. She starts removing the cloth covering everything when she suddenly sees someone leaving the room in the mirror, and she immediately follows him. Anne tells Grace that they are telling her that this house belongs to them and that they will be taking all the curtains down. Grace scolds Mrs. Mills, saying that until now, no one has entered her house without her permission. Then, Anne shows Grace a drawing she made. Anne has drawn pictures of all the people who are currently residing with them in the house, meaning Grace and her children are not alone in that house. Anne mentions that there is an old woman living in their house who watches them all the time. Anne claims that Victor told her that the old woman is a witch. Grace locks Nicholas and Anne in the room. Hereupon, she takes down all the curtains from the house and begins searching the entire house with a gun. During the search, Grace finds a book filled with images of many people who are all asleep when Mrs. Mills arrives, telling Grace that this book is of the dead. And these people are not asleep, but rather deceased. People of the last century took photographs of dead individuals like this because they believed that this way, the souls of the deceased would remain alive in the pictures. Following this, Grace heads back to her children's room, kisses them, and prepares to leave when Nicholas asks her when Daddy will come back. Grace replies that when the war is over, their father will return. Now we see Grace alone crying in a corner of the house, meaning she is deeply missing her husband, and she feels quite lonely. Just then, she hears the sound of a piano playing. She takes her gun and goes into the room where the sound of the piano was coming from. She sees that no one is in the room, so Grace locks the piano and steps outside, but the door shuts itself behind her, slamming against her face and locking from the inside. Grace quickly takes the key from Mrs. Mills to unlock the door and finds the piano's keyboard open, which she had just locked moments ago. Grace tells Mrs. Mills that this is impossible, as she searched the room herself, and there was no one there. Grace starts feeling that there is a malevolent spirit in her house that is disturbing her and her children. Grace tells Mrs. Mills that someone there is definitely not human. Someone among us is very restless, and so she sets out to find help from the local priest. Mrs. Mills tries to stop Grace, but she doesn't listen and asks Mr. Tuttle to find out if any family was buried nearby and if their son was named Victor. Mrs. Mills tells Mr. Tuttle that Grace believes their house is haunted. Tuttle asks if it would be safe for Grace to go out in such thick fog, to which Mills says she won't be able to go too far. Tuttle asks Mrs. Mills how long they must keep this secret, to which Mills replies, "Until the right time comes." Just then, Mrs. Mills indicates Tuttle to cover a nearby gravestone with leaves. Meanwhile, Grace loses her way in the thick fog, meaning she is lost when she suddenly hears footsteps approaching her. Now what she sees makes her doubt her eyes, because standing before her is her husband, Charles. Grace asks Charles where he had been all these years, to which Charles replies that he had been wandering in search of his home. After this, they both return home. Grace introduces Charles, who looks dazed, to Mrs. Mills. Charles first goes to meet his children. Anne and Nicholas are very delighted to meet their father after all these years. Now we see Charles in his room, and it looks like he is not okay. We see Mrs. Mills telling Anne that she too has seen the people Grace cannot see. She states that there are some things Grace does not want to hear or understand, but soon she will see those people as well, and everything will change. Mrs. Mills tells Anne that much will change in the future. The scene shifts, and we see Lydia, Mrs. Mills and Mr. Tuttle, where Mrs. Mills is explaining that Grace is now behaving as if nothing has ever happened, and that Charles seems to be unaware of where he is. After this, we see Grace dressing her daughter in a bridal dress, telling her she will be back shortly, and then she leaves. She approaches Charles, who still appears dazed, but since he does not respond, she comes outside and tells Anne to take off the dress. She enters Anne's room and notices that Anne's hands look weak and wrinkled like an old woman's. She approaches to take a closer look, and now dressed in the bridal gown is not Anne, but a withered witch with entirely white eyes. Grace asks her where her daughter is. The old woman responds that she is her daughter. In anger, Grace attacks the witch and pulls off the dress. Grace realizes that it is Anne. Scared, Anne distances herself from her mother, and just then Mrs. Mills shows up. Anne tells her that her mother wants to kill her. Anne leaves, calling Grace wicked. Now Grace comes into Charles's room, where Charles tells her that Anne has revealed everything to him. Grace says that at first, she thought there was someone else in the house, believing it to be a ghost, but Charles says he is not talking about ghosts, but about the incident that happened that day. Charles says he just came to say goodbye to Grace and his children, as he has to return to the war, but Grace does not want Charles to go to war again. Grace says that war is just an excuse. You want to leave me. And the scene cuts here. We see that it's morning, and Grace wakes up noticing that Charles is not in bed, so she goes out to look for him. However, he is nowhere to be found. Charles has once again left Grace alone. Just then, Anne opens her eyes and sees that the curtains in the room have been drawn back by someone, causing her to scream. Grace immediately rushes towards her mansion. She enters the room and finds the curtains have been removed. She takes off her overcoat and covers her children with it. Wherever Grace takes her children, the place is filled with light instead of curtains. Then Anne says she wants her father, to which Grace replies that Daddy is gone. Now Grace asks Mrs. Mills where all the curtains have gone, to which Mills says that perhaps someone wants to bring light into the house. She suggests to Grace that she should bring her children into the light once to see if they are okay. Angered by this suggestion, Grace fires all of them from their job and orders to leave the house and sets out to find the curtains herself. Just as the three of them arrive there, Grace tells them that she has realized that they want Grace to leave the house so that they can take over her home. So she points her gun at Mrs. Mills and takes the house keys from her, afterwards leading them all outside. Outside, Mills tells Tuttle that it is time to bring out the gravestones. Now Grace begins searching throughout the house for curtains. We see Anne going into the woods outside her house during the dark night to look for her father. Nicholas wants to join her, so both siblings head into the woods to search for their father, Charles. While searching for curtains, Grace goes upstairs and enters Mrs. Mills's room, thinking she might have hidden the curtains when she discovers a photograph underneath the mattress. We see Anne noticing some gravestones outside her house. We then see Grace holding an envelope dated 1891, inside of which is a photograph. When Grace pulls out the photograph, she is utterly shocked to see that it features Mrs. Mills, Lydia, and Mr. Tuttle, all of whom are dead, meaning Mills, Lydia, and Tuttle are no longer in this world, and those with Grace are their souls. This means that these three died in 1891, and Anne also reads the name Mills on a gravestone, which makes her realize that she is a ghost. Meanwhile, the three figures approach Nicholas in the woods. Anne tells Nicholas to run away because he does not realize that Mills, Lydia, and Mr. Tuttle are ghosts, prompting Nicholas to flee as well. Upon hearing her children's screams, Grace takes the gun and rushes into the woods to save her children. She gets them back inside the house while firing at Mills, Lydia, and Mr. Tuttle, but the bullets have no effect on the three. Mills tells Grace that they died of tuberculosis long ago, so Grace throws away the gun and rushes back to the mansion, locking the door from inside. She embraces her children and tells them to stay together, no matter what, and to hide somewhere in the house. Mills tells Grace that she wants to explain to her the new conditions inside the house, while Anne and Nicholas hide themselves in a cupboard. Mrs. Mills tells Grace that they will leave her alone, but will the outsiders leave her alone? Tuttle says that it was the intruders who removed all the curtains and that they are inside with her and her children. They will find you very soon. Now the scene shifts to the cupboard, where we see Nicholas and Anne hearing a voice from outside. It is an old lady. Downstairs, Mills informs Grace that the outsiders have found her children, so go upstairs to talk to them. Grace begins to go upstairs. When she opens the door, she sees some people sitting there, one of whom is an old lady acting as a medium, talking to Anne. The old lady asks Anne what happened in this room. What did your mother do to you? Anne whispers into the old lady's ear that she is afraid of that pillow, to which the old lady responds that if you are dead, then why are you still living in this house? Anne asserts that she is not dead, and Nicholas and Grace all insist they are not dead but alive. However, the new owner of the house learns that Grace killed her children by suffocating them with the pillow. Grace rushes to shake the table, but does not seem to be seen by anyone. She begins tearing and throwing papers, yet she remains invisible to others, meaning Grace and her 2 children are indeed no longer in this world, but they refuse to accept that they are dead. The new owners, who are human, no longer want to stay in this haunted house. Now comes the movie's most emotional scene, where Grace confesses that after Charles left, she felt completely alone and overwhelmed by loneliness, suffocated her children with the pillow, and then she took the rifle and shot herself, ending everything. Just then, she hears the laughter of Nicholas and Anne from the bedroom and sees them playing with the pillow as if nothing ever happened. At that moment, Mrs. Mills's spirit appears and notifies Grace that the intruders are leaving, but someone else will come here after them. Nicholas asks his mother if Daddy died in the war, to which Grace responds, yes. Grace tells her children that all she knows is that she loves them very much and that this house belongs only to them and to no one else. In the final scene of the movie, we see Nicholas and Anne playing in the sunlight, not bothered by it, while Grace states that no one can make them leave that house. All 3 of them watch from the window as the people who bought the house leave. In the closing scene, we also see Victor looking at the window. Perhaps he is able to see Grace, Nicholas, and Anne. Now all the people leave the mansion, but we still see that the for sale signboard remains attached to the gate outside, indicating that someone else will come and go, and this cycle will continue forever. And with this emotional scene, the movie comes to an end.